Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Brooke, and I'm one of the co-founders of Paction. Today, we're covering a really important topic in making science simple, canine genetics for puppy shoppers. And we're lucky enough to have Dr. Samantha Van Buren here today with us. Welcome, Sam.
Hello.
Hello. So, just a bit of background on Sam. So, she's a geneticist who specializes in canine genomics. Her current role is senior geneticist at Orivet Genetic Pet Care, which has recently merged with Paw Print Genetics, who many of our breeders are familiar with. And in her role at Orivet, Sam develops and interprets DNA tests for dogs and supports both breeders and veterinarians in interpreting these results. And she's also an animal breeding and geneticist adjunct professor teaching those courses at Husson University. And above and beyond all of that, she's also an active breeder and an exhibitor of moody dogs. And in this way, she really brings together both the scientific and hands-on perspectives to her work in canine genetics. So, just to kick things off, we're so glad to have Sam here today with us. She's going to help provide some clarity around genetic testing and why it's so important in dogs. We hear really often from our breeders that so few puppy shoppers are asking relevant questions around genetic screening. So, in this way, it really represents a gap in making informed decisions when getting a dog. So, the broader issue there is really in the market as a whole, this lack of inquiring about genetic testing from puppy shoppers. The demand side of the market doesn't incentivize breeders to continue to do it. And it's really those who care very, very much about their dogs and who are incredibly responsible, who are diligent in screening and doing the health testing and all the genetic screening on their dogs. So, we're here to talk about why every single breeder should be doing genetic testing. And then from the general public's perspective, it's not necessarily common knowledge that dogs are the most selectively bred species in the history of the world. They've experienced bottlenecks in their genetic diversity over the years. And, this is really due to humans breeding them for very specific purposes. So, you can think about dogs bred as working dogs on farms or those meant specifically to live in cities and hunt vermin back in the day. And this really is a unique history for animals on the planet and for dogs as a species. So, we're here to talk about why genetic testing is important and how it's distinct from other types of health testing or healthcare. So, colloquially speaking, many folks tend to believe that health testing is limited to things like veterinarian visits, vaccines, and like the deworming of puppies before their forever homes. But there's really still little attention from the average folks looking for companionship dogs on the subject of genetic screening of the parents, before a litter is even bred. So, the goal of this short webinar today is to share in layman's terms why genetic screening is important, how it works, and why you should choose a breeder who's reliably testing their dogs. And Sam's going to help us get a grasp on the subject and arm all of you with the right questions to ask and what to look out for when you're speaking to your breeder. So, with that, I'm going to pass it over to Sam to give us some background and really just help us get oriented on the topic of canine genetics.
Yeah, so canine genetics has advanced tremendously in a short amount of time. In just the past 2 decades alone, we've gone from knowing very little about the genes that shape a dog's health and traits to having the ability to test for hundreds of conditions across all breeds. It's actually hard to imagine now, but this kind of testing simply wasn't possible until fairly recently.
Right. So the dog genome wasn't even sequenced until about 20 years ago. So can you give us a bit of a brief history of why and how genetic testing in dogs has evolved in the last decade or two? And I'm really thinking here about like the average Canadian who maybe hasn't had a dog in 20 years or since they were a really little kid and potentially are unaware of the recent changes and all of the possibilities now and the capabilities of this type of testing. So, what can you share to get us up to speed?
Absolutely. So, the first complete dog genome was published in 2005 using a female boxer named Tasha. And that really opened the door for researchers to start identifying mutations and developing tests. But what's changed in the last 10 to 15 years is really accessibility. So, sequencing technologies have become faster and much more affordable, which means these discoveries can now be translated into easy to use cheek swab tests for breeders and owners. At first, testing was really limited to research labs with just like a few diseases and certain breeds. But now, thanks to decades of dedicated research and collaboration between scientists, veterinarians, and breed communities, we can now screen for hundreds of traits and conditions with just one simple sample.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I know, everybody's interested in, swabbing their own sample and understanding their own ancestry and their own personal genetics. So it's really cool that we're now able to do that for dogs as well. So yeah, very cool. So before we get into the specific questions that were submitted from prospective puppy shoppers, for those who don't have any science background at all, what is genetics in layman's terms? So I know I have many friends and colleagues who haven't taken science since, way back in high school. So what do people really need to know to have a basic understanding of how this works?
Yeah, great question. So every dog inherits two copies of each gene, one from each parent, and changes in these genes, which we call either mutations or variants, can influence things like disease risk, coat color, structure, or even drug response, like MDR1. Modern canine genetic DNA tests look for these specific variants, and once researchers identify them, tests are developed, and then this helps breeders identify carriers and make more informed breeding decisions.
Got it. No, it makes a lot of sense. Understanding the mother and the father before you breed a litter. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense why that's so important.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've collected some common questions for those who have registered for access to this video, and we want to be sure to address those. Some real questions that real folks have. So the first question that we hear about a lot, and we received a lot of these submissions with this registration as well, is why do most humans not screen themselves genetically before having children? Yet there's this recommendation that we should be choosing breeders who screen for our dogs.
Yeah, that is a very important distinction to make. So, in people, genetic testing is a personal medical choice that has complex considerations. But when we talk about breeding animals, it's a completely different context because dogs can't make these choices for themselves. And thus, it becomes our responsibility as breeders and owners to use the information available to prevent avoidable suffering.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And even just, given the history of how dogs became to be who they are, was so heavily influenced by humans making decisions for them. So the least we can do with, the whole history that we've essentially created for this species would be to do the responsible thing. Yeah, and do that screening for them. So that makes a lot of sense for sure. And I think there's probably also some evolutionary considerations there too, right? Where, most animals out in the wild, there's evolutionary pressure for, why they choose which mate they do. And that's not what's happening with dogs these days. It's typically humans who are choosing who's bred with whom. So makes a lot
Exactly.
of sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so given that, that makes, incredible sense for sure. So what does choosing a responsible set of, breeding pairs, like a mother and a father, which, dam, sire, however you want to call it, what does that look like?
Yeah. So choosing your breeding pair starts with looking at the whole animal. Health testing is the foundation. Breeders should be screening for known genetic conditions in their breed, ideally using both DNA tests and physical screening. So that's when you may think of like OFA exams for hips, eyes, heart, etc. But behavior and temperament is also very important to take into consideration. Dogs should have stable, predictable temperaments that align with the breed's purpose, and are also suitable for life as a companion or working partner, depending on what that breed was bred for. And that means evaluating things like confidence, sociability, drive, and not breeding dogs with unstable or extreme behaviors.
Mhm.
Physical traits should also be considered in the balance, such as selecting for dogs that conform to the breed standard and are structurally sound enough to do the job that the breed was meant for. So, in short, responsible breeding pairs are chosen based on health, temperament, and structure together, with the overall goal of producing well-rounded and healthy dogs.
Got it. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense for sure. Yeah, getting back to the average person who's looking for a dog. So if I were to have no science background at all, and genetics sounds like an intimidating topic, how do I ask breeders the right questions about genetic screening? And then even if I get the questions right, how do I understand it? And how do I understand the answers they're giving me?
Yeah, that's such a good question because genetics can definitely sound a little overwhelming if it's not something you're familiar with every day. But it's really about asking those right questions and looking for transparency from the breeders. So start by asking breeders what health testing they do before breeding. And a responsible breeder should be able to clearly explain which genetic tests, orthopedic screenings, and other health exams their dogs have had and why those are important for the breed. If you're not sure what conditions are relevant for your breed, that's where the Paction breed guides can really help because they are listing the most common genetic conditions in each breed and which ones have available tests. So, good breeders overall appreciate questions as it shows that potential owners are doing thorough research.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. Yeah, it's just as important on the puppy shopper side of things, to arm yourself with, all of this background so that you're also doing your due diligence for sure. Um, yeah, and it's a great indication that you're really committed to doing a good job, um, as a dog owner. So absolutely. Okay, the final very common question that we get, a lot of questions around what tests can actually predict and what they cannot. So what are the common misunderstandings about how genetic tests really work and what they actually predict?
Yeah. So, one of the biggest misunderstandings is that genetic testing can predict everything about a dog's future health, and that's simply not true. DNA tests identify whether a dog has a mutation or is clear, but they don't necessarily guarantee whether that dog will ever show symptoms. Um, and as many conditions depend on both gene and environment.
Mhm.
Another misconception is that testing covers every possible risk, and in reality, each test looks for specific known discovered variants. There are still many diseases and traits which we don't fully understand yet. Um, and so while testing is a great tool, it's not the whole picture. So genetic testing overall is really valuable to breeding decisions, but it's best used as one piece of a larger picture alongside other health screenings, temperament evaluations, and overall sound breeding practices.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense for sure. Absolutely. And there's, so much work done now on epigenetics and all kinds of, um, other factors as well. So it would be no different in dogs.
Mhm.
So absolutely, it makes a lot of sense. Okay, well, that's it for today. We're gonna end it off there. And thank you so much, Sam, for joining us today and answering all of these questions. This really serves as an amazing foundation, for people who are thinking about getting a dog and what they should be, asking breeders and getting them up to speed on what's happening in the breeding world, in the most responsible aspects of breeding these days. Yeah, and we can't wait to have you back and dive deeper into some of these topics because obviously this is just, scraping the surface of everything that canine genomics has to offer. So yeah, we look forward to having you back, Sam, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.